Diao Chan, the Enchantress, has now arrived to Grand Archive. Hi, I'm Eva, and today we'll be introducing the Diao Chan Idyll Corsage Recollection deck, which releases on March 7th, 2025 alongside the expansion set Abyssal Heaven. Recollections are a premium pre-constructed product. It's a convenient bundle with everything you need to start playing right out of the box, with a deck and accessories for it. Recollections generally have a higher power level than that of a starter deck, though they do need upgrades to become competitive. This Diao Chan deck has a 4 out of 5 rating in terms of complexity and learning how to use its mechanics. However, be warned, it is a challenging deck to win games with. I would highly suggest tweaking the ratios of the cards and/or modifying it with upgrades. I'll suggest a few ideas for these at the end of the video and will do my best to walk you through the intricacies of this big brain deck. Diao Chan is a champion of the Cleric class, and this deck uses the basic element Water, both of which are experts at interaction and persistence. Her playstyle is Control, focusing on reactions during her opponent's turn. As she levels up, she unlocks the Tera advanced element, planting flower buds that will bloom into ominous news for her enemies. Here's the deck list. Something to note is that there are 0 allies in this deck. You'll be engaging in no combat. Instead, Diao Chan casts spells, collects fractals and fantasias, and summons tokens. Marked with a red asterisk are cards that currently can't be found in Grand Archive's booster sets and are exclusive to this recollection. But before we dive into the deck, let's peruse this gorgeous Diao Chan themed bundle. It all comes in a lovely storage box made of durable cardboard that stays shut magnetically. Diao Chan graces the inside with her efflorescent beauty. It comes with these bewitching Dragon Shield art sleeves, 100 count, a damage counter that can be used to track both damage and the amount of glimmer you have. More on that later. And you have art dividers to keep your cards organized. Inside the pink box, there are 2 plastic-wrapped sets of cards. The larger one contains your pre-constructed deck with a 60-card main deck and 12-card material deck. The other pack of cards has the tokens you'll need, as well as extra copies of certain cards in the deck to ensure that you own 4 copies of every card and have complete playsets. Lastly, it comes with 3 booster packs of Abyssal Heaven First Edition, in which you have a chance to pull stunning collector signature rares of Diao Chan. And if you're super lucky, some of you may find a little extra box topper containing a CSR version of the card Season's End, which is a bit like Diao Chan's Ultimate. Let's go ahead and spring into this deck, starting with your champion lineage. It begins with your level 0 Spirit of Water, draw 7 cards. Then introducing level 1 Diao Chan, Enchantress. She's a cleric human. She has, on enter, put 2 glimmer counters on Diao Chan. Then she has an effect that allows you to use those glimmer counters. Rest her to activate a reaction spell card from your memory. Pay its reserve cost only by removing that many glimmer counters from Diao Chan. Activate this ability only during an opponent's turn. This gives you an extra resource for interaction, allowing you to play a card that you've put down into your memory zone and typically can't use while it's there. Reserve cost is the yellow cost on cards, but it also considers any cost reduction effects. So for example, Acquiescing Rejection has class bonus. This card costs 1 less to activate, so it would cost 3 glimmer instead of 4. And remember, it has to specifically be a spell reaction, which you'll find as the subtypes on the card. This sneaky ability is something you'll have in your pocket for the rest of the game even after you've leveled up, as it is an inherited effect. Speaking of leveling up, level 2 is Diao Chan Dreaming Wish. She has Diao Chan lineage, meaning it must level up from another Diao Chan champion. Another inherited effect. At the beginning of your end phase, if the amount of glimmer counters on Diao Chan is less than the amount of fantasias you control, put an amount of glimmer counters on Diao Chan equal to the difference. This will let you hopefully refill your glimmer counters every turn, matching the amount of fantasias you own. Fantasias are another specific type of card. Finally in the lineage is level 3 Diao Chan Idyll Corsage, a Tera advanced element champion that allows you to now start playing Tera cards. She has 2 different abilities, one that happens the turn she enters the field, and another that persists for the rest of the game. She has, on enter, choose any amount of non-champion objects and put a wither counter on each of them. Let's pause here to discuss what a wither counter does. At the beginning of a player's main phase, if they control 1 or more objects with wither counters on them, for each of those objects, they sacrifice it unless they pay 1 reserve cost for each wither counter on it, then remove those counters. For example, if an object has 3 wither counters on it, your opponent has to pay 3 reserve cost. And as they're putting cards down during their main phase, this slows down their own game plan. A little technical detail. At the beginning of the main phase, the game triggers the checks for all wither counters at once as one event. There's not opportunity between each wither counter being paid, so do everything that needs to happen before the wither starts resolving. Let's also define what exactly is considered an object. Objects are typically things on the field that are interactable, including your champion lineage, allies, weapons, items, domains, fantasias, and tokens. Now, level 3 Diao Chan's second ability can be, but is not always, related to her first ability. Whenever a non-token object an opponent controls is destroyed, you may banish it. If you do, that opponent summons a Flower Bud token. So if your opponent doesn't pay their wither counter taxes, their objects get destroyed, and so that's one way to trigger this ability. But don't forget, their objects being destroyed, sacrificed, dying by any method at all will trigger this. Another very important detail that's easy to miss. You must be able to banish the destroyed object from their graveyard. That means the object has to land in the graveyard first. Regalia from the material deck when destroyed goes straight to the banishment already, and so you do not have the ability to banish them. Therefore, no Flower Bud token. Now these Flower Bud tokens, they're not crazy. They have no effects or stats. But don't worry, plant your garden and later you'll be able to watch the seeds bloom into something a bit more deadly. Ooh, also take note, a Flower Bud is a Fantasia token, and that can be relevant. Let's quickly review the new mechanics here. Glimmer counters. Diao Chan uses them to play spell reactions from memory during her opponent's turn. Wither counters. Put them onto objects and make your opponent pay their property taxes. Flower Bud tokens. When level 3, give these to your opponent if their object is destroyed and you banish it. Moving on to the rest of the 12-card material deck, returning from previous sets are these Regalia. Terrafring. Banish this during your opponent's recollection phase. Until end of turn, players can't declare attacks unless they pay 2 reserve cost. Cleric Robes has this activated ability you can use throughout the game. Pay 1 reserve cost and rest this card to prevent the next 1 damage that would be dealt to your champion this turn. Can be a tool to help Diao Chan survive a little longer. Crystalline Mirror. Whenever a Fantasia enters the field under your control, glimpse 1. Then class bonus. You can banish this card to destroy target item with memory cost 0 or reserve cost 3 or less. Activate this ability only if you control 3 or more Fantasias. Now for brand new cards. Glimmer Essence Amulet. Whenever a Fantasia you control is destroyed while it's not your turn, you may banish Glimmer Essence Amulet. If you do, draw a card. Hairpin of Transience. Class bonus, banish it to put 3 wither counters on target non-champion object. Your opponent will now have to pay 3 to keep that object. Scepter of Fascination, Diao Chan bonus, banish it to wake up your champion. Put 2 glimmer counters on your champion. Since using glimmer requires resting your champion, waking up will allow you to use glimmer twice in 1 turn. Now for the Tera cards that you can't play until you've unlocked level 3. Staff of Blossoming Will has Diao Chan bonus. Pay 1 reserve cost and rest this item. Target player summons a Flower Bud token. Most of the time, you want to give the Flower Bud to your opponent, but sometimes you might want to use this to give it to yourself. And lastly, Kaleidoscope Barrette. Before we read its ability, let's define the keyword Empower. Empower comes with a number, and it means the next spell card you activate this turn activates and resolves as if your champion got plus that number, level. This will power up certain cards that look at your level. At the beginning of your recollection phase, empower X, where X is the amount of Fantasias you control. Then, if X is 4 or greater, reveal the top card of your deck and put it into your material deck preserved. If a card is preserved, it goes into your material deck face up. It's public information to your opponent. Then, on your materialized phase, you can choose to put that card into your hand instead of materializing something. It's effectively drawing an extra card per turn, and if you have multiple preserved cards, you can pick and choose what you need. Let's now start looking at the 60-card main deck. Fantasia is a type of card that stays on the field after you play it. Then a fractal is a subtype of Fantasia. Fractals typically have reservable, meaning you can rest them to pay for 1 reserve cost. It's great value. The first 2 fractals in this deck help with finding the important cards that you need. Fractal of Insight. On enter, you may rest it to glimpse 2. Fractal of Refreshment has, on enter, you may reveal up to 3 water element cards from your memory and put them on the bottom of your deck in any order. Then draw that many cards into your memory. Alright, I'm cheating now. This one's not a Fantasia or a Fractal, but it kind of belongs better here than anywhere else in the video. Idyll Thoughts allows you to arrange the top 4 cards of your deck, also has floating memory. It's a classic. Okay, back to fractals. The remaining 3 fractals help Diao Chan survive and stall the game. Protective Fractal. Instead of using it to pay for reserve cost, you can rest it to prevent 1 damage taken. Torpid Fractal has, on enter, rest target ally with 2 power or less. That ally doesn't wake up during its controller's wake-up phase as long as you control Torpid Fractal. Unstable Fractal has this powerful activated ability, though you will lose this fractal after you use it. Pay 3 reserve cost, rest this card, and sacrifice it. Then, as a spell, destroy target item with memory cost 0 or reserve cost 5 or less. The as a spell part means that this ability will not work on items with Spell Shroud, as they can't be targeted by spells. However, this fractal has hindered, meaning it enters the field rested, so you cannot use its destroy ability on the first turn you play it. Here's a tip. Pair this card with the Regalia Glimmer Essence Amulet. If you pop the destroy ability on your opponent's turn, you can draw a card. Now the next one is a Fantasia, but not a fractal. It doesn't have reservable, but will still give you the value of a card in another way, hopefully. Eventide Lure has, on enter, look at the top 5 cards of your deck. You may reveal, this means show to your opponent, a Fantasia card from among them and put it into your memory. Put the rest on the bottom of your deck in any order. If you have the Regalia Crystalline Mirror on the field, you'll want to do your Glimpse one first to increase your chances of Eventide Lure finding at least 1 Fantasia. We like this card a lot for early game because if your opponent destroys your reservable fractal, you effectively lose the value of a card. But with Eventide Lure, you've already gotten your card, so letting it be vulnerable is a-okay. And there's one more Fantasia in this deck that will be covered in a later section. Now let's start going over spell reaction cards. Reminder that Diao Chan can play spell reaction cards from her memory using glimmer counters during her opponent's turn. She's very interactive. Dissuading Halt protects you by giving target unit's attacks -3 power until end of turn. This has floating memory. In a similar vein is Chill to the Bone. Depending on whether you control less or more than 2 Fantasias, you can give a target attacking ally -2 power, -2 life, or -4 power, -4 life until end of turn. Use this to kill things because if an ally's life were to become 0 or below, it simply dies. Redirect Flow is an interesting card with a very specific use, aka quite hard to use. It says, you may choose new targets for target trigger. What is a trigger? These would be triggered abilities, such as on enter, on attack, on death, or when the effect says at, when, or whenever. It's important to note that the new targets that you choose must be legal targets for that triggered ability. For example, the card Mercurial Heart has, on enter, put a buff counter on target automaton ally you control. If your opponent plays this and you redirect flow, you can change that target to another automaton ally that your opponent controls, to be precise. It can't go to one that you control or a non-automaton ally because that's not what that card does. Moving on. Now, since this is a water deck, there's going to be some good old negate spells. If something is negated, it does not resolve. Use these cards to control the flow of the game. The classic negate, Frostbind. Negate target card activation unless its controller pays 2 reserve cost. Banish the card that had its activation negated this way. Glimmering Refusal is very similar, but can have a much higher ceiling. Instead of negating unless they pay 2 reserve cost, the number is the amount of Fantasias you control. Here's an interesting new negate card, Acquiescing Rejection. It negates target card activation unless your opponent lets you draw 2 cards. Use this to go up on card count, but the timing to use this card is tricky. You don't want to use it on something too weak because your opponent may just deny you the card draw, but it's also not necessarily the negate you want to use against something too strong because you can't stop it. The final negate card is one of the most interesting of this deck and surprisingly more potent than you might think. Blossoming Denial has a lot of text, so let's break this up. It has a reserve cost of 3, but as long as an opponent has 5 or more cards in their memory, this card costs 3 less to activate, aka you can play it for free. Then the first of its 3 effects. Negate up to 1 target card activation unless its controller pays 3 reserve cost. Second effect. Your opponent summons 2 Flower Bud tokens. The third effect only happens if you're level 5 or higher. Recover X, where X is the amount of Fantasias on the field. Now, how do you get to level 5 when this deck caps at a level 3 champion? This is where Empower comes in to temporarily boost your levels. There are a few extremely important things to remember with this card. Firstly, it says, negate up to 1 target card activation. This can be 0. You can just drop this card without anything to negate. It's absolutely an option to play this on your own turn using the Empower from Kaleidoscope Ret, just to recover and gift Flower Buds. The second pivotal but subtle detail. It recovers as many Fantasias as are on the field, including your opponent's Fantasias. This is big. All of the various flower tokens you give your opponent count as Fantasias. It also includes the 2 flower buds they just received. You can potentially undo all the damage your opponent has done to you. Then you're back in the game. Now these are the cards related to wither counters to make your opponent pay their taxes. Interestingly, most of these cards are Tera. In our playtesting, we often did find ourselves not dipping into the wither mechanic at all until level 3. Frostnip Pirouette spreads the love by letting you choose any amount of non-champion objects and put a wither counter on each of them. In contrast, Frostlorn Caress really targets one thing by putting 4 wither counters on it. And now the Tera cards. Shriveling Vines is a Fantasia that stays on your field and says, at the beginning of your end phase, put 2 wither counters on target non-champion, non-token object you don't control. Then the most wither you can give. Ripples of Atrophy lets you put 2 wither counters on any amount of non-champion objects. Cost 6, but efficiency makes this card cost 1 less for each level you are, so Empower could give you a nice discount here. And loading up the field with wither counters combos sweetly with the next card. This is Diao Chan's signature card, Season's End. It has a high reserve cost of 10, but this card costs 1 less to activate for each wither counter on objects on the field. Then the most powerful board wipe in Grand Archives so far. Destroy each object with a wither counter on it. That's right, you can use this to clear everything your opponent owns besides their champion. Ideally, you have this card the turn you go to level 3, or if you have Frostnip Pirouette or Ripples of Atrophy. All these things let you put wither counters on essentially as many objects as you want. If you must, you can also put wither counters on your own objects to make Season's End cheaper to play. Except don't do this with Diao Chan level 3, because the wither counters will apply during your materialize phase. Then come your main phase, you will have to pay taxes. The wither counters get removed no matter if you choose to pay or sacrifice the object. They won't be there by the time you're able to activate Season's End at slow speed. And the final wither card is Bloom Winter's Chill. This is one of 2 available cards that will trade in your opponent's flower buds for more impactful plants. There are 2 different ways you can use this card. The first is by activating the card normally for this effect. Each opponent sacrifices all flower buds. For each flower bud sacrificed this way, their controller summons your choice of a Nightshade or a Floodbloom token. You can mix and match how many of each token. The Nightshade token says, at the beginning of your recollection phase, that is, your opponent's because this is on their field, put a wither counter on target non-champion, non-token object you control. Unfortunately, this does mean your opponent can strategically choose what to put this on, so I generally don't recommend it. The Floodbloom, on the other hand, gives, at the beginning of your recollection phase, banish the top 2 cards of your deck. If your game is running extremely long or your opponent is playing a deck that goes through cards quickly, this actually can be the winning chip. They will lose the game if they attempt to draw a card and have nothing left. But you do not have to use this flower bud trait effect of this card. It has another use entirely. You can directly discard it from your hand and pay 2 reserve cost to empower 2 and draw a card. This does not count as activating the card and is an activated ability that can be done at fast speed. It's a good way to instantaneously empower and without going down on influence. And the final cards of this deck. There are only 3 cards available that can potentially inflict damage. Refracting Missile deals damage to target unit equal to the amount of fractals you control plus 1 and has floating memory. Similarly, Shimmering Refraction deals X damage to target unit, where X is the amount of Fantasias you control. Take note that this card looks at Fantasias, while Refracting Missile cares about fractals specifically. Then it has, if Shimmering Refraction was activated from your memory, draw a card into your memory, so playing this using Glimmer will give most value. And lastly, the other Bloom card to trade in flower buds is Bloom Summer's Glow. Your opponent loses all flower buds, and instead you can give them Licoria and or Baihua tokens. The Baihua token says, at the beginning of your recollection phase, each opponent recovers 1. If you've taken a bit of damage and are confident in stabilizing over a longer game, using this makes it harder for your opponent to kill you. Or you can choose to gift a bouquet of Licoria. Each Licoria has, at the beginning of your recollection phase, deal 1 unpreventable damage to your champion. Just like the other Bloom card, this one also has the same discard from hand ability. However, I pretty much advise against using this card for that unless you very desperately need Blossoming Denial's Recover to survive. The Baihuas and Licorias are too good. Now let's consider some strategy tips and tricks for piloting this deck. First thing you do, maybe open up that box of extra cards this thing comes with and rejigger the ratios. I'm kinda kidding, but also entirely serious. This is an example of an adjusted deck list without adding any outside cards that my playtest partners and I liked. Most importantly is maxing out your Refracting Missiles, Shimmering Refractions, Bloom Summer's Glow, and Season's End. These are key. As this is a reactive control deck, try to be patient. Make sure you have resources to deny your opponent's critical plays, and take certain damage if you know you can recover it later. Generally, the magic number of Phantasias you want on your field is at least 4. Then you'll have plenty of Glimmer refills, and Kaleidoscope Barrette will start preserving cards. On your turn, you can probably play 1 Fantasia then pass, or sometimes you just play nothing and wait. Once you're Diao Chan level 2, you should be able to sit there until it feels right to go to level 3. It kind of depends on what your opponent's doing and when they bring out stuff that you want to destroy. Ideally, when you go to level 3, you have a Season's End in hand to burn down your opponent's field. Up to this point, you may want to use Fractal of Refreshment and Glimpses to search for this card. For your next 2 materializations after level 3, get the Kaleidoscope Barrette first if you have 4 or more Phantasias because extra card per turn is nice. Otherwise, grab the Staff of Blossoming Will. Now that you're Tera, stabilize using Blossoming Denial to slow down your opponent, give Flower Buds, and recover a bunch. Remember, it recovers for every Fantasia on the field, including the tokens you give your opponent. Stall as much as you can using Wither and reactions, and use the 2 Bloom cards to plant ticking time bombs on your opponent. The blooms are fairly crucial. In the case that your opponent doesn't have many cards left in their deck, use the bloom to hand them Flood Blooms. If you're in a pretty safe spot, give them Licoria to deal damage over a few turns. If you've taken damage and it's unlikely that your opponent will blast you to death in 1 turn, consider giving Baihua to recover every turn, making it more difficult for them to cross the finish line. Then figure out some way to close the game eventually. This win con may be using Shimmering Refraction once you've built up a big board of Phantasias. Did you know you can also use the Staff of Blossoming Will to give Flower Buds to yourself? They are Phantasias that make your Shimmering Refractions hit harder. One last thing is with Wither. We found Wither mostly relevant when paired with Season's End, but if your opponent has a scary thing you want to blow up, pay attention to the amount of cards they have. If their influence is 6 or lower, you can pair Frostlorn Caress with Hairpin of Transience to give that thing 7 Wither counters that they can't pay for. Teehee. And lastly, we'll list some upgrade considerations. I can already see there are many different and awesome ways to build Diao Chan, but for the purpose of this video, we're only looking at a few simple potential adjustments that don't stray from the identity of the original deck too much. First of all, recommend if you can, swapping out to the level 0 Fragmented Spirit of Water. Its biggest benefit is that it gives you a Spirit Shard token right away that counts as a Fantasia. Now some staples. Dungeon Guide to level up more efficiently, and also makes it so that you hit level 3 in the middle of your main phase, so you can now put Wither counters on your own objects to help pay for Season's End if necessary. And Fractorize is essential for any water deck to either disable your opponent's items or weapons, or increase your own fractal count. One way to do that is to play Backup Charger, which draws a card and gives you a Power Cell token, which is an item that you can fractorize. For Phantasias, these 2 are really good. Captivating Opulence would make your opponent have to pay 2 reserve costs just to banish Grand Crusader's Ring. And Dissonant Fractal is extremely cheap, costing 1. The Glimpse 4 is strong to find your win cons. Speaking of win conditions, you'll probably want to add some more in this deck. Burst Asunder can be very explosive, but risky as you lose your fractals, dealing damage for each of them sacrificed. Scepter of Awakening is an incredible regalia that turns a Fantasia into an ally that can attack for a turn. Its base power and life would be equal to its reserve cost, and in this case, it doesn't look at cost reduction effects. It's simply the yellow number in the corner. Also puts a buff counter on it, and as long as you have 4 or more Phantasias, you can go ahead and bring this out during your main phase. What a fun card. Say you want to shift the deck and add some actual allies, you can play Fantasia allies. Ups your Fantasia count, and you can find them using Eventide Lure. Frostworn Paladin is solid in most water decks. If you can spare the floating memory, then great. If not, a 2/3 is still pretty good. And some defensive tools. Against the deck with many attacking units, Beauty Gossamer Jade and the new Divine Relic Art of War can set very annoying hurdles. If your opponent has big allies, you can use Covenant of Thorns to redirect damage coming at your champion to their ally instead. Or, honestly, this one's just really funny, Enthralling Chime lets you gain control of target ally with 3 or more Wither counters on it, combo with a Hairpin of Transience, and yoink your opponent's ally right off their field. Though if you want to keep it, make sure you're prepared to pay for those 3 Wither counters you've just adopted along with it. Thank you so much for watching. Next step, if you're interested in a deck where you go on a quest to tame a dragon, head over to Main Deck's channel to get your training on the Guo Jia Re collection, Heaven's Favored. I want to give a shout out to all my NorCal friends who helped with playtesting, giving advice, ideas, but especially to Fome, Andrew, and Duckcats for really helping me figure out Diao Chan. Abyssal Heaven and both recollections are out March 7th, 2025. Thank you and happy glimmering!